If the world is truly to put itself onto a net zero emissions pathway, we're going to need to see a transition across the whole economy pretty much. Triton announced its own commitment to net zero emissions using science-based targets. There'll be many opportunities for private equity to invest and to help grow emergent sectors in this low carbon transition. At these latest in almost 3 decades of annual talks, we saw real progress as leaders and their delegates from around the world came together to further ambition on climate change. We saw the adoption of 1.5 degrees of maximum global warming now as the core target for this UN process, and that's a big step forward. We also saw a pledge to curb and indeed reverse deforestation by 2030. Now that would be great for the climate and for biodiversity and indeed socioeconomically as well. Probably worth treating with some caution, as we've actually had such pledges in the past which have failed to stem that tide. And then we had some areas where perhaps there was some disappointment. So for instance, there was expected to be a hard structural plan to phase out coal from power generation, which is frankly an essential step in achieving these sorts of global warming targets, but that kind of agreement was not reached by the end of the conference. So last month, Triton announced its own commitment to net zero emissions using science-based targets to achieve a net zero level both operationally and for all of our portfolio companies by 2040, which will put us in line with a good probability of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by century end. Operationally, there's many measures that can be taken. These include greater energy efficiency and then investment in procuring cleaner power and producing it on site in some cases. We have a company called Dan Taxi, which is seeking to transition its fleet towards electric vehicles over the next few years. And then strategically, companies can pivot in a new direction with their business. Deep Ocean, for instance, is seeking to move away from its traditional market of offshore energy towards greater client relationships with offshore renewables. If the world is truly to put itself onto a net zero emissions pathway, we're going to need to see a transition across the whole economy pretty much. And so that's going to mean continued transition in power generation towards renewables and other low carbon alternatives. We're going to need to see a clean transport sector beyond electric vehicles towards trucks and ships and other technologies as well. Technologies like carbon capture and indeed the hydrogen ecosystem will play a role in decarbonising those sectors and others, indeed particularly industrial sectors like steel and cement. And then we're going to need to see cleaner agriculture, buildings, and indeed things like plastics and packaging. One of our portfolio companies, IFCO, provides sustainable packaging which can be reused for long periods of time to the food industry, and that's a much more environmentally benign way of providing packaging than we've seen for other alternatives in the past. There'll be many opportunities for private equity to invest and to help grow emergent sectors in this low carbon transition.